Erling, Iowa, 1928. The air inside the convent was thick with fear. Beelzebub, Judas, Mina, hell, 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 screamed the voice of a woman whose body had just levitated and clung to a wall with cat-like grip. Her limbs writhed against iron restraints, her eyes rolled back, and from her mouth came guttural snarls that seemed too many for one throat. Nuns recoiled. A priest raised a crucifix, and the woman wailed, "I cannot bear that. It is unbearable." Her name was Emma Schmidt, though the world would come to know her as Anna Eklund, a devout Midwestern Catholic whose harrowing exorcism in 1928 remains one of the most chilling and contested episodes in American religious history. For 23 days, inside a rural Iowa convent, Emma's small frame was a stage for what witnesses called a cosmic showdown between God and hell. To some, she was truly possessed. To others, she was a woman shattered by trauma and misunderstood by a system that reached for demons when it lacked answers. This is not a ghost story. It's a case file, one built from first-hand accounts, church records, medical blanks, and modern re-evaluation. From childhood torment to whispered curses and a final cry of "Praised be Jesus Christ," we follow the full arc of Emma's strange and tragic journey. Welcome to Bad Things. Join us as we trace the steps of Emma Schmidt, dissect the theories surrounding her infamous possession, and ultimately ask the question, what most likely happened? Emma Schmidt was born in 1882 in Marathon, Wisconsin, to a German Catholic family. After her mother died, Emma was raised by her father, Jacob Schmidt, an alcoholic who, according to later claims, made unwanted advances toward her. When she rejected him, he allegedly cursed her, a turning point Emma herself would later identify as the beginning of her torment. By age 14, she experienced disturbing symptoms. She could no longer enter church without being overwhelmed by blasphemous thoughts. She reported hearing inner voices, described as sinister, urging her to desecrate sacred spaces. There were times, she recalled, when I felt impelled to shatter my holy water font and tear down the very house of God. Doctors found nothing physically wrong. One prominent physician called her normal in the fullest sense. With no medical explanation, her family and local priests turned to the church. There was also Aunt Mina, Jacob's lover, and a figure Emma associated with darkness. Known for her scandalous behavior and rumored to practice witchcraft, Mina was said to have cursed Emma by lacing her food with spellbound herbs. Rumor or not, Emma believed it, and so did many around her. In 1912, the church approved her first exorcism. It was conducted by Father Theophilus Reisinger, a German Capuchin friar who had never performed one before. The ritual was short but intense. Emma screamed, convulsed, and resisted prayer. Afterward, her symptoms eased, temporarily. Over the next 16 years, her condition deteriorated. The voices returned, this time claiming to be not just demons, but the spirits of Jacob and Mina. She described internal battles between good and evil, fought over her soul. "Saint Michael came to my aid," she once said, during what she believed were spiritual trances. By 1928, Emma had become desperate. Now in her 40s, she had been plagued for over 2 decades. The church arranged a second secret exorcism, this time in Erling, Iowa, far from public view. Father Reisinger, now experienced, would perform the rite again. Father Joseph Steiger, pastor of St. Joseph's Parish, offered the use of a Franciscan convent nearby. The Bishop of Des Moines approved the plan. Emma arrived in August 1928. The moment she entered the convent, her demeanor shifted. She hissed at the nuns, refused food. She knew it was blessed, one sister said, and growled like an animal. Father Steiger's car mysteriously malfunctioned on the way to pick up Reisinger, only to start working again once they arrived. Reisinger calmly remarked, "The devil will try to foil our plans." What followed was 23 days of exorcism spread over 3 sessions. August the 18th to 26th, September 13th to 20th, and December 15th to 23rd, 1928. Emma was tied to an iron bed. She thrashed violently, vomited green bile, spoke in multiple voices and languages, and allegedly levitated. When commanded, the voices identified themselves: Beelzebub, Judas Iscariot, Jacob, and Mina. The physical symptoms were disturbing. Her stomach swelled to unnatural sizes, her strength exceeded expectation, and witnesses claimed her body bent the iron bed frame. The stench in the room was described as unbearable, drawing curious townspeople near the convent. By the 3rd session in December, all involved were drained. On December 23rd, Emma suddenly sat up, then collapsed, whispering a final sequence of names: Beelzebub, Judas, Jacob, Mina, Hell. Then, silence. She opened her eyes and spoke softly. "From what a terrible burden have I been freed at last." She drank water, ate food, and returned to prayer. The exorcism was declared successful. Emma resumed her life in privacy. The convent where it happened was eventually torn down. For nearly 7 years, the story remained secret, until it was published in a 1935 booklet titled Begone Satan, based on eyewitness testimonies and approved by the church. Despite Emma's anonymity, her story became legend. By 1936, Time magazine had covered it. In the decades that followed, it inspired books, forums, and films, including elements of The Exorcist. Emma reportedly died in 1941. Her case is now remembered as one of America's most dramatic and contested exorcisms. One that still raises a question nearly 100 years later. What really happened? The 1928 exorcism of Emma Schmidt, better known under the pseudonym Anna Eklund, has occupied a strange space in American history. Part religious testimony, part medical mystery, part cultural artifact. In the decades since the events in Erling, Iowa, scholars, skeptics, theologians, and internet sleuths have proposed a range of explanations for what happened. They rarely agree. Some assert that Emma was truly possessed by demonic entities, expelled only through faith and sacrament. Others believe the entire episode was a product of untreated mental illness or religious hysteria. And then there are hybrid theories, blending psychology, folklore, and even critique of institutional power that seek to explain Emma's symptoms without invoking the supernatural. We explore the major theories below. Number 1. Demonic possession. Catholic Church's view. The Catholic Church's official stance is unwavering. Emma was possessed by literal demonic spirits, including Beelzebub, Judas Iscariot, and the damned souls of her own father and Aunt Mina. According to this interpretation, these entities entered Emma through a combination of sin, curses, and family wickedness, and were only dislodged by prolonged exorcism using the Ritual Romanum. The Church points to classic markers of possession: speaking unknown languages, supernatural strength, revulsion toward holy objects, and clear recognition of blessed versus unblessed food. Witnesses reported Emma hissing at the sight of crucifixes, vomiting foul green bile, and levitating onto the wall with cat-like grip. Perhaps most famously, she allegedly responded to Latin prayers with mocking Latin phrases, a language she was never formally taught. The evidence that convinced a Capuchin priest and inspired decades of controversy, wrote the Daily Nonpareil, was that Emma blasphemed whenever holy relics were brought near her, foamed at the mouth, made a variety of animal sounds, detected blessed food and rejected it, spoke and understood Latin, and levitated to the ceiling in front of witnesses. Proponents of this view also point to Emma's sudden recovery. After the third session in December 1928, Emma was reportedly calm, coherent, and spiritually restored. Her first words after the final expulsion, "Praised be Jesus Christ," are seen as a declaration of liberation. Father Steiger's housekeeper, who witnessed much of the exorcism, later testified, "Some of the scenes were even more frightful than described. There is not the slightest doubt in my mind that the devils were present." In this view, no psychiatric explanation can account for the multilingual taunts, the physical contortions, or the inhuman screams reported by clergy and nuns. Emma's suffering is seen as both literal and moral, the cost of sins visited upon her by her family, and an example of how faith, when applied with discipline and belief, can triumph over darkness. Number 2. Psychological or psychiatric illness. A widely held secular theory posits that Emma was not possessed but mentally ill, suffering from a mix of psychological conditions exacerbated by a repressive religious environment. Her symptoms line up with what modern psychiatry might diagnose as schizophrenia, dissociative identity disorder, or severe PTSD. She began experiencing auditory hallucinations in her teens, shortly after the loss of her mother and in the presence of an allegedly abusive father. Her inner voices urged blasphemy and sin, not uncommon content in religiously framed psychosis. Emma's reaction to church rituals, trembling, vomiting, uncontrollable outbursts, could stem from deep psychological trauma tied to her father's sexual advances. Psychiatrist Dr. Richard Gallagher, who has studied historical exorcisms, notes that religiously obsessed hallucinations are often shaped by cultural context. In devout communities, those hearing voices may believe them to be demons. Supporters of this theory also address Emma's supposed language skills. Given her German-American upbringing, she was likely bilingual in English and German. Her responses in Latin, the most mysterious element, could have been memorized snippets from church services, echoed back in emotionally charged moments. The ability to mimic phrases doesn't require fluency. Physical phenomena like vomiting, swelling, or unexplainable strength can also manifest in states of hysteria, conversion disorder, or extreme stress. Hysterical strength is a documented condition where individuals in altered mental states perform feats well beyond their normal capacity. As for the foul odors, some psychologists point to the power of suggestion. In enclosed spaces under extreme stress, smell hallucinations are not uncommon. From this standpoint, the exorcism acted less as a supernatural ritual and more as a dramatic placebo. Emma, believing in demons, needed a symbolic confrontation to release her psychological burden. When told the demons were gone, her mind complied, and the symptoms ceased. Number 3. Hoax or exaggeration. A more skeptical theory suggests that the events were fabricated or embellished, either by Emma herself or by the clergy involved. Emma may have exaggerated her symptoms, consciously or unconsciously, as a way to escape trauma or gain attention. Alternatively, the priests, particularly Father Reisinger, who went on to become one of America's most well-known exorcists, may have seen the case as a professional proving ground. By 1928, Reisinger had performed 19 exorcisms, and Emma's case was uniquely dramatic. Some suspect that the most sensational elements, levitation, voices in Latin, vomited leaves, were not as literal as later accounts claimed. Skeptical scholars, including Joseph Laycock, note that the most widely circulated version of the story came from a Catholic booklet titled "Begone Satan," which was written 7 years after the exorcism and approved by church authorities. This version carefully aligns with doctrinal messaging. Meanwhile, a lesser-known 1934 pamphlet by Reverend F. J. Bunce includes prophetic visions and spiritual claims that the church later downplayed, suggesting some degree of narrative curation. If the church had political motives, Laycock writes, it would have made sense to promote the version of Emma's story that demonstrated the power of the right, but downplayed the supernatural prophecies and mystical claims that could not be verified. Critics point out that no neutral doctors, journalists, or outside witnesses were present at any of the exorcisms. All known details come from deeply invested parties. To some, that renders the entire event suspect. Number 4. Psychological suggestion and role enactment. Closely related to the mental illness hypothesis, but distinct in its focus, is the theory that Emma was not mentally ill, but rather the product of strong social suggestion. She was told she was possessed and surrounded by people who expected to see demons, so she acted the part. This phenomenon is known as iatrogenic illness, when the diagnosis or treatment itself causes symptoms. In Emma's case, being labeled possessed from a young age could have shaped how she expressed distress. The more fervently her community believed in the demons, the more she internalized those beliefs. From this perspective, Emma's behavior was not calculated deception, but adaptive performance. Her mind, especially under physical duress, molded itself to fit the role. When Father Reisinger demanded that the demons name themselves and leave, Emma's subconscious responded by externalizing them one last time. Beelzebub, Judas, Mina, hell, and then silence. This theory draws on research into exorcism cases where the possessed individual is cured the moment the ritual ends. It suggests that Emma's case, far from proving possession, demonstrates the power of belief and social dynamics. Number 5. Feminist and cultural theory. Control through ritual. A more modern and critical lens argues that Emma's possession narrative was a mechanism of patriarchal control. In this view, her behavior, particularly around sexual themes, reflects a woman resisting the roles and constraints placed upon her. Her symptoms began in adolescence, a time when many girls begin asserting autonomy. In a conservative Catholic household led by an abusive father, such rebellion might be reinterpreted, not as independence, but as blasphemy. The solution? Remove her agency through ritual. Exorcism, writes one cultural theorist, became a symbolic punishment for nonconformity. Emma's body was bound, her voice spoken through by others, and her recovery only declared valid once she complied with the expectations of her religious caretakers. This theory does not deny Emma's suffering. Rather, it argues that the form her affliction took and the solution imposed were shaped entirely by her context. A male-led religious institution took her trauma and reframed it as sin and spiritual warfare, then resolved it in a way that reasserted its own authority. Number 6. Trauma-induced dissociation, hybrid theory. A final theory occupies the space between faith and psychiatry. Emma was not lying, nor were her symptoms purely psychotic. Rather, her demonic experiences were the language her trauma chose. Victims of childhood sexual abuse often report feelings of possession, out-of-body episodes, and a sense that something evil has taken over them. These experiences are not lies. They are dissociative responses to overwhelming pain. In this light, Emma's story of cursed herbs, spiritual voices, and grotesque behaviors becomes a coded autobiography. Her father cursed her because he harmed her. Her aunt was a witch because she betrayed or failed her. The demons she battled were her abusers, now living on in her subconscious. From what a terrible burden have I been freed, she said after the exorcism. That burden may not have been Beelzebub. It may have been 26 years of shame, fear, and silent memory. The story of Emma Schmidt, better known as Anna Eklund, is not one of demons in the traditional sense. What most likely happened inside that convent in 1928 was the culmination of decades of unprocessed trauma, shaped by religious worldview and expressed through a culturally sanctioned ritual. Emma wasn't faking. She wasn't staging a hoax. She was, most plausibly, a woman suffering the long-term psychological fallout of abuse, and acting out that pain in the only language her world gave her: possession. The earliest clues point clearly to trauma. Emma lost her mother young, was raised by a domineering and possibly predatory father, and was rumored to have been cursed by her aunt, a woman also suspected of dark deeds. At 14, she began hearing voices urging blasphemy and violence, particularly in religious settings. These are not arbitrary symptoms. They reflect internal conflict projected onto sacred space, a known phenomenon in survivors of sexual abuse raised in strict religious households. Her demons had names: Jacob, Mina, Judas, Beelzebub. The inclusion of her father and aunt alongside religious archetypes suggests not so much a spiritual invasion as a psychological decoding. Her mind, unable to name the abuse directly, gave the pain form. The fact that those identities emerged only under religious pressure and exited the same way is telling. Everything about the 1928 exorcism was theatre, but not in the sense of fabrication. It was ritualized catharsis. Emma screamed and contorted and vomited bile, not because a literal devil had taken residence inside her, but because she had spent years being told there was no other explanation for the darkness she felt. In a world where priests offered deliverance and doctors offered nothing, the exorcism became her cure, not medically, but symbolically. That the ritual worked doesn't mean it expelled demons. It means Emma was finally told, with authority, that the burden was no longer hers. The final scene says it all. After days of agony, she whispered the names one by one: Beelzebub, Judas, Mina, Jacob, hell, as if naming her pain one last time. And then, silence. She opened her eyes and said, "From what a terrible burden have I been freed at last." That moment was real. It was her mind's surrender, or her mind's victory. The demonic identities she had carried for years were given a ritual send-off, and the priests, though working from a medieval playbook, gave her something no doctor had offered: a narrative of release. It's no coincidence that after being told the demons were gone, Emma returned to normal life. She ate, she drank, she prayed. The cycle had ended because she believed it had. This wasn't the supernatural at work. It was the psychological power of belief, shaped by ritual and given permission to heal. Emma's recovery wasn't permanent, according to some fringe accounts, but the major manifestations never returned. The church, sensing both the power and the danger of the story, sanctioned its publication while omitting the more mystical elements later recorded in unofficial texts. Her tale became a tool of warning, of faith, of narrative control. But behind the Latin, the bile, the shrieks of "Begone Satan," was a woman who'd been hurt young and never given the language to say it. Possession was the only diagnosis her community could understand. And exorcism, violent, loud, and dramatic, was the only form of therapy she was offered. In the end, what most likely happened to Emma Schmidt was not divine intervention or devilish intrusion. It was trauma playing itself out on a religious stage with an audience that believed wholeheartedly in the script. The exorcism worked, not because evil left her, but because she was finally allowed to believe it had. That's the true power of ritual. Not that it casts out demons, but that it gives suffering a shape, and sometimes, when it's done just right, an ending.